Okay, this is one piece I made out of a piece of acrylic. I've got like a 45-degree angle on one side, about a 65-degree angle on the other side. It's flat on the top. It's a little taller than what I needed, but it will work in the application I'm using it for. The next picture here is where I've actually modified the piece that I'm wanting to use, but I actually got it a slightly off center and it was a little narrow on one side, so I put a piece of tin thou styrene there to fill in the gap. I used a big piece because it's easier for me to place, so it's a little larger than it actually needed to be. Then I basically took some scissors, trimmed it to shape, but it's still kind of crude. So once it was thoroughly dry, I went back with a hobby knife, X-Acto knife, and using the facing of the component itself, used as a guide, trimmed off the excess parts of the plastic there. And what you wind up with then is something that pretty much exactly fits that piece of acrylic and works well in this application for what I did. I also enlarged the hole because I decided to use a regular LED instead of SMD in this case, since there actually is plenty of room. As you can see in this picture here where I have trimmed the excess plastic off, it looks pretty good. It matches the other side real well also. And here I'm showing a picture of the clear acrylic actually glued in to that component part. And I've got some wires connected to it in the LED. I'm going to actually give you a quick demo of. Okay, just completed inserting the piece of clear acrylic into the front piece where it houses the flasher. Now, it's actually a bit larger than it needed to be, but I can always mask and paint that. But right now I'm driving it with my Arduino Nano, only using the one pin, which is way overkill for this, but considering basically I want this to eventually have remote control to be able to fire the front and rear photons, which will also be driven by the same Arduino. Not a bad project. Anyway, yeah, I think it looks pretty good. It's plenty bright. Maybe a little too bright. I may take that down a little bit. But anyway, making some progress. Okay, now that I've finished with the little piece here, got the acrylic in, got the LED in place, what I want to do is go ahead and do some flat sanding on this edge here to make sure that everything is smooth. Same on the sides, looking to see if there's any imperfections. I'm going to just go ahead and flat sand this now. This is 600 grit wet or dry sandpaper, using it dry, of course, at the moment. Don't want much, just enough to make sure that any of that excess glue is gone. Looks like it needs just a little more. That's basically good for this piece now. It looks good, to my eye anyway. And it does have the LED in place. So the next step is to get some solder on these leads and get them wired in place. Normally I would not recommend soldering on top of this because it's going to get damaged as you use it anyway, but keep it good, looking as good as possible for as long as possible. And what I've got to use, I've got a little cup of rosin, and I've got a couple of spools. This is 36 gauge, 1/4 pound, 3100 foot magnet wire. This has got a green enamel coating on it. This came from adaptengineering.com. And again, it's 36 gauge, which is fine for normal LED or SMDs, single runs. Don't want to use this for strip lighting, but for these single LEDs, it's fine. And it is a good wire, and it is a low temp wire, which means the soldering iron that I have is a fairly cheap station. It doesn't put out a tremendous amount of heat. Let's see if I can get up there where you can see it. Okay, it's just a real cheap soldering station. But anyway, since it doesn't put out a lot of heat, the regular magnet wire, I usually use like a little butane lighter to melt insulation on it, since this one really doesn't get quite hot enough. Okay, I also have one of my favorite storage devices here, a shoebox with my heat shrink. And what I want to do is find the smallest possible piece. Okay, so now I've got my trusty magnifying lens. Okay, now I've got this 36 gauge magnet wire. I need to remove the enamel. And this magnet wire has a low temp melting point, so you don't have to have a powerful soldering station. As a matter of fact, I got a real cheap one here. And just run it across there for just a second, and that's removed all the enamel. Now that I've got this tinned, I'm going to take this heat shrink, slide it over and down, and I'm going to take a small dab of solder on my soldering iron, hold this in place. It's best if you can find a way to brace your hand. I'm bracing it against this base here. And there we go, it's in place. Give it a little tug to make sure it's holding firmly. Then I'll take my heat shrink and slide it into place, making sure that it fully covers all of the bare metal, and it does. And just using the edge of my soldering iron, just barely rub it along that tube. And you could use a heat gun, but this works also. And this heat shrink ideally would have been a bit smaller, but it's what I have, so it's what I'm using. And it's going to serve the purpose. The purpose, of course, is to keep any part of this from any chance of shorting to the positive side. And it will run down this way. Okay, that's fine. Then we get the positive side. I've already pre-tanned it to save a little time here. I'm going to put it same cradle. Just a little spot of solder on the tip of the soldering iron. A little touch of solder. And that's good. Pull this leg down also. Now, this has got to go not too far, so I'm going to cut them at about right here. Because they're just going to have to go mainly through that hole into a connection point I'm going to have inside the model. So I'll put those away for the time being. Alright, now that I've got those wires soldered in place, we got the neck, and what I want to do is inspect this carefully for any flaws or issues. And right there is a small seam line, a little excess resin there. So this piece actually needs to be cleaned up. I want to get this piece as clean as possible before I glue this piece on. So I'll be back in a moment. Now what I've done is cleaned up this neck as much as possible. I also ran into an issue where I was pulling my wire out. I actually needed to go deeper. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it starts flat here and then it goes closer to this tube here because there's actually a pin in this piece here that this sets in, and I didn't want to take any chance of that pin pushing down into my wire, and I really didn't want to remove the pin because it helps with alignment. So I thought the best solution would be just simply take the back section here and increase the depth closer to this tube. So now it's just about 1/8 of an inch or a little more, maybe 1/4 of an inch above the top of the copper tube. And then I've went and sanded pretty much every inch of this. Of course, it's already been washed. Then I went back and put spot putty. There was a little spot, a little void there, a couple up here, and a little mold release mark there. Put some putty, sanded it smooth, put some putty on it versus taking too much of the resin away by actually doing all of it by sanding it. And it was the same way on this side. So that's pretty smooth now. There's was a little void over on this side that I filled with spot putty. And on the back side, a couple of little spots there and a little spot here. Just odds and ends, not much. And like I said, it's pretty much all been sanded now. All the little grooves, I've actually went in and sanded them in here also. So this is pretty much ready for the primer coat. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and attach this guy with its wires onto it. And I'm going to go ahead and hit this with primer because I want to make sure that this is as good as I need it before I do any further assembly. It's going to be a lot easier to do it now than it will be when it's any further together. So I want to go ahead and do that now. And that's what I'm going to work at. So what I'm using to glue this on with, I've got this gel super glue. It works really good. And I'm going to take this piece, set it up there, and let's take it a little further forward. Okay, and I'm going to have to cut that down just a little more because this heat shrink is a little thicker, but that's no problem. Take my big file. Again, like I said, these big files make quick work of that resin. I'm sure that's enough now. Oh yes, that's going to fit fine now. Get the wires coming out the back. Okay, I'll get my glue ready. I'll be back in just a second. Okay, now I've got my glue. Go ahead and put some here. This gel, I like it because it doesn't run all over the place. Along the sides. And I don't want to get too much, so that should be plenty to hold this in place. So I'll pull my wires out the back, set this up, make sure it's in position, and just hold it. I don't have my kicker handy. Plus it'd be hard to get any in there anyway, where that's at. Okay, now I'm gonna let this dry for a minute and get my finger off of it, and I'm gonna see if there's anything else I need to do. If not, I think I'm gonna hit this with a coat of primer, make sure everything's looking good before I proceed to the next step. Okay, now that I've worked on the neck for a bit, I've got it aside drying. I'm going to work on the bulb a bit. First thing I did, of course, it's been washed, scrubbed, was to drill a 1/16 pilot hole at the end, and then followed up by a 1/4 inch drill centered. Had to trim a little of the interior a bit, but it does indeed now fit on the neck. The next thing I want to do is drill out the front of the torpedo tube, and to do that I'm going back in with a 29/64 inch drill bit. Flip it over to where I can keep it good and flat. Oh yeah, I believe that was the best size to have chosen. Now I've got a hole all the way through, so there's plenty of room to mount my photon torpedo tube launcher. I'm going to use a piece of brass tube in there, and then a piece of photo etch and a couple of LEDs that we'll need to mount inside the bulb. Now, as I said, on the back side where I drilled this hole in, it was a 1/4 inch, but it was a bit tight. I did trim this clear resin a bit to allow the neck to fit in better, and then I kind of ogled it out a bit in order to give it a little slop, but that's fine, because what I'm going to actually do with this bulb, when I go to attach it, rather than using super glue, I'm going to use like a 5-minute epoxy, and I'm going to clamp the neck in place level, clamp this in place to where I can adjust it as necessary, and clamp it in place, and then put 5-minute epoxy on the tube to hold this bulb in place on the neck. That way I won't be in a big rush like super glue would do for me, and it's going to hold just as well, of course, if not better than super glue would. Okay, I've got that part done. Now I'm going to go see if I can find a piece of copper tube. I'll be back shortly.